The restaurant, tucked away in the heart of London's exclusive district, exuded a polished elegance, its walls adorned with modern art, and its tables set with flawless precision. The soft murmur of conversation blended with the delicate clink of wine glasses, the faint hum of classical music playing in the background. It was a place where the city's elite dined, a space reserved for those who had earned their place in its glittering, unreachable world. Barron Trump and his mother, Melania, stepped into the restaurant, quietly scanning the room. Their presence wasn't unnoticed, but they tried their best to blend in, seeking nothing more than a quiet evening. As they sat at their table, the soft leather of the chairs creaked under their weight, and the air seemed to carry a subtle chill. Melania glanced around, her composure steady, though there was a subtle tension she couldn't shake. Barron, ever the curious young boy, scanned the elegant surroundings with a quiet fascination, not fully aware of the silent gazes that followed them. The waiter, a young man with an air of nervousness about him, approached their table. He took their order with brisk efficiency, but his eyes flickered with discomfort, shifting anxiously around the room. Melania sensed the unease in the air, though she couldn't pinpoint why. She offered a polite smile, but the waiter's quick departure left an unsettling silence in its wake. The room, despite its beauty, now felt a little smaller, a little more stifling. It wasn't long before the same waiter returned, his steps heavier this time, his face pale and filled with barely contained awkwardness. As he spoke, his words barely made sense. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't serve you here. It's the policy. We can't serve certain guests." The statement hung in the air like a cloud of disbelief. Melania's brow furrowed, her calm demeanor faltering for just a moment. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with confusion. Barron, sitting beside her, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could feel the shift in the air, the growing tension that wrapped around them like a thick blanket. The waiter, sweating now, mumbled something about an unwritten rule, but his words were empty, hollow. He couldn't bring himself to explain, and it only made the situation more surreal. Barron's youthful confusion turned into frustration, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. Melania, however, maintained her composure, though the sting of being unwelcome was sharp. "This is absurd," she muttered under her breath, her jaw tightening. She didn't know what had just happened, but she wasn't about to leave without an explanation. The eyes of the other patrons were now fixed on them, some glancing away awkwardly, others staring with open curiosity. Every moment felt like a silent judgment, but Melania would not be deterred. She wouldn't let her son, or herself, be dismissed like this, not without a reason. The discomfort in the room grew unbearable, but Melania stood her ground. "We're not leaving until we understand why this is happening," she said firmly, her voice breaking the silence with quiet resolve. The weight of the situation grew heavier with each passing second. Melania's eyes flicked toward Barron, who sat beside her, his brow furrowed in confusion. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as a quiet dinner had become something entirely different. The whispers of nearby patrons grew louder, and the waiter's nervous demeanor made the air feel charged. His hand shook slightly as he fumbled with his notepad, unable to meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It's just the policy. We can't serve you." His voice was strained, almost apologetic, but it didn't make the words any less cutting. Melania's calm exterior faltered, the confusion in her chest tightening into something deeper. "Policy? What policy? We've done nothing wrong. Why are you refusing us service?" Her voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now, an edge that came from a place of disbelief. She wasn't used to being treated this way, not by anyone, and certainly not in a place as prestigious as this. The waiter hesitated, glancing around the room as though seeking some kind of reassurance. When none came, he turned and walked away quickly, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. A few moments later, the manager appeared, his presence almost predatory. He was a tall man, sharp-featured, dressed in an immaculate suit that seemed to carry an unspoken authority. The moment he reached their table, he didn't greet them with the usual politeness. His eyes flicked briefly to Barron, before focusing entirely on Melania. "I'm sorry, but we simply can't have you here," the manager said, his voice just a little more clipped than the waiter's had been. The clientele here might feel uncomfortable with your presence. The words hit Melania like a slap in the face. Uncomfortable? What had they done? She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Barron's eyes were wide, his lips pressed into a tight line as he sensed the growing tension. He looked between his mother and the manager, trying to piece together what was happening. It was clear now that this wasn't about a policy at all. This was about something else. Something unspoken. I don't understand, Melania finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Are you saying we don't belong here? The manager's face remained emotionless, but his eyes spoke volumes. I'm afraid I am, he replied coldly, his words final. Barron shifted uncomfortably, the reality of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. His young face reddened, not from embarrassment, but from the sting of injustice. It wasn't right, and he knew it. Melania stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving the manager's face. We're not leaving, she said, her voice firm now, the anger she'd kept at bay finally breaking through. Not until I understand why you've treated us this way. The murmurs around them grew louder, the judgment heavy in the air. The manager didn't move, his posture rigid. The restaurant felt like a pressure cooker, the heat of the situation nearly unbearable. But Melania wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. Just as Melania felt her chest tighten with the frustration of being forced to leave, the restaurant doors swung open, cutting through the oppressive silence. A well-dressed man entered, his tailored suit commanding attention as he walked with the air of someone accustomed to power. He moved with purpose, his gaze sweeping across the room. But the moment his eyes landed on Barron, his stride faltered, and his eyes widened. For a fleeting second, the man froze. There was no mistaking the recognition that crossed his face. In an instant, his expression shifted from casual interest to a knowing smile. Without hesitation, he crossed the room toward Barron and Melania, his footsteps now eager, his eyes locked on Barron. Mr. Trump, it's been quite some time, the man greeted, his voice full of warmth and familiarity. He reached Barron's table with the swift confidence of someone who knew exactly how to command a room. He extended his hand to Barron, who looked up in surprise, still processing the sudden change in atmosphere. Look at you. You've grown so much, the man continued, his tone jovial, as if Barron were an old friend. Melania watched the exchange with a mix of disbelief and quiet fury. The manager, who moments ago had refused them service, now stood frozen in place, his face drained of color as he witnessed the man's recognition. The transformation was immediate, like a switch had been flipped. The manager's stiff posture softened, his earlier coldness evaporating. He rushed to the table, now practically bowing in deference. I am so sorry, Mr. Trump, he stammered, his voice now smooth and apologetic. I didn't realize who you were. Please allow me to offer you the best seat in the house. Barron stood up slowly, his hand extending hesitantly to the man who had recognized him. His eyes met his mother's for a brief moment, and in that look Melania could see the confusion and surprise in her son's face. His expression seemed to say everything. Why the sudden change? The waiter, who had just moments ago been so firm in his refusal, now stood awkwardly by, eyes wide, stammering apologies as he fumbled with the silverware. I didn't mean, I wasn't aware. Please forgive me, he said, clearly flustered and unsure of how to navigate the shift. Melania could feel her blood boiling. The hypocrisy of it all was clear. They weren't treated with respect because of who they were as people, only because of who they were perceived to be. The restaurant's policy had evaporated into thin air, leaving only the raw sting of elitism behind. As the man continued to greet Barron with exaggerated warmth, the whispers around the room grew louder. The other patrons, who had once watched in silence, now seemed to understand what had just happened. The atmosphere, once stiff with judgment, now hummed with the realization of the discrimination that had just taken place. Barron's face remained a picture of shock, his hand still outstretched as he shook the influential man's hand. Melania, despite her quiet anger, couldn't help but feel a cold, unsettling clarity in that moment. The world they were in wasn't about fairness. It was about who you were connected to, who recognized you, and who didn't. And it stung. The air felt thick with a tension that neither Melania nor Barron could shake off. They sat at the table, a strange silence settling between them, despite the activity around them. The once vibrant, energetic atmosphere of the restaurant had become a quiet hum, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The privileged guests who had once whispered about them now turned their attention elsewhere, but their stares lingered in the corners of Melania's mind. She could feel the weight of judgment, though the focus had shifted from her and Barron to the commotion that had just passed. Barron's eyes were still wide, his face a mixture of confusion and quiet hurt. His small fingers fidgeted with the edge of his napkin, his thoughts clearly racing. "Why did they treat us like that, Mom?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a depth that made Melania's chest tighten. He wasn't angry. He was trying to make sense of something that had no logic, no fairness. His innocence, the belief that everyone should be treated equally, was shattered in an instant, and it cut her heart in ways she hadn't expected. Melania paused before answering, gathering her thoughts. She could see the hurt in Barron's eyes, a reflection of the very thing she had tried to protect him from. She leaned forward slightly, her hand gently resting on his. "Some people, they see things differently. They judge you not for who you are, but for who they think you are," she said softly, her voice wavering ever so slightly. "It's not about us, sweetheart. It's about how they choose to see the world. Sometimes they build their own rules, and we don't fit into them." Barron didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked around the room, his gaze darting from one face to another. The guests who had once quietly observed them now seemed absorbed in their own conversations, oblivious to the emotional toll they had left behind. Barron's eyes narrowed, as though something inside him clicked. He was starting to understand the game they had been unknowingly thrust into. The exclusivity, the invisible barriers, the judgments wrapped in layers of privilege. They were all part of a world that wasn't as fair as he had imagined. The waiter and the manager, who had once seemed so sure in their dismissal of them, now hovered nearby, their eyes apologetic but empty. The apologies felt hollow to Melania, a forced gesture meant to salvage their own reputations. The difference in their behavior was glaring. Just moments ago they had been ready to throw her out, but now they wanted her approval, desperate to make things right. It was as if their entire demeanor had been an act, a performance to maintain the illusion of control. Melania could feel the divide between them and the rest of the world now more clearly than ever. She could feel Barron's gaze shift, the quiet understanding settling in. The world wasn't as kind and just as it seemed, and some people were never going to see them for who they truly were. As the last course was cleared and the final sips of wine were finished, the restaurant slowly returned to its rhythm. The noise around them began to fill the space once more, the soft clinking of plates, the murmurs of polite conversation. But the air between Melania and Barron was still thick with the weight of the day's events. It had been an evening that neither of them had anticipated, one that would mark a shift in Barron's view of the world. The discomfort lingered in Melania's chest, but there was something else now, something quieter, more resolute. The influential man who had recognized Barron rose from his table to leave, his group of high-profile associates trailing behind him. He nodded at Melania and Barron on his way out, his smile still wide, though there was something almost patronizing about it now. Melania felt a twinge of anger at how easily the facade had been dropped, the way the world bent for those with influence. But she held her composure, feeling a strange sense of relief, not from the apology they'd received, but from the realization that she and Barron had remained steadfast. They hadn't bent to the invisible forces trying to push them out. They had held their ground, and that, in itself, was enough. Barron sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful, his young mind clearly processing what had just happened. The earlier confusion had shifted into something deeper, a quiet understanding that wasn't there before. As Melania stood up to leave, he followed her, his steps slower now, a more deliberate pace. There was a stillness to him, as though he had just crossed a threshold of awareness. As they reached the door, Barron looked up at his mother, his voice quiet, but filled with a maturity that was new. "I get it now, Mom," he said, his words simple but heavy with the weight of everything they had just experienced. "Not everyone is going to treat us the same." Melania felt a lump form in her throat. She had tried to protect him from this, tried to shield him from the harsh truths of the world. But now, in that moment, she realized he had learned the most important lesson of all. It wasn't just about how people saw them. It was about how they saw themselves. They could walk through the world's judgments with their heads held high, because no one had the right to define their worth. They walked side by side, hand in hand, as they stepped out of the restaurant and into the cool evening air. The city stretched out before them, its lights twinkling like distant stars, but the weight of the world no longer felt so heavy. The quiet understanding between them was palpable, a shared knowledge that no matter how unfair the world might be, they would face whatever came next, together, without fear. The world could look at them however it wanted, but they knew who they were, and that was enough. Have you ever been judged or rejected unfairly? You're not alone. Remember, the world might try to define you, but only you know your true worth. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't let anyone else's standards determine your value. Subscribe for more stories that inspire strength, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. Keep walking forward, no matter what.